The letter arrived at the Dusty Creek post office on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1882, written in a hand so careful and deliberate that the postmaster held it up to the light just to admire the penmanship before dropping it into the outgoing mail sack, never suspecting that those few folded pages would change two lives forever. Clara Whitfield had not planned to write the letter. She had sat down at her kitchen table that rainy April evening with every intention of writing to her cousin in St. Louis, the one who kept promising to send seed catalogs and never did. But somewhere between dipping her pen into the inkwell and pressing the nib to the first sheet of cream paper, something shifted inside her chest, loosened like a knot that had been pulled too tight for too long, and what came out instead was something raw and honest and entirely unplanned. She was 22 years old, and she was alone in a way that the Nebraska prairie seemed designed to amplify. Her father had died the previous October, leaving her the small homestead outside of Milford with its 40 acres of hard soil, its leaking barn, and its mule named Ezra who had opinions about everything. Her mother had passed when Clara was 14, and her only brother, Thomas, had gone west to California 3 years before with a mining outfit and written back only twice. The second letter had arrived 8 months ago. She had stopped expecting a third. She was not looking for a husband. She wanted to be clear about that, even in her own mind as she wrote. She was not one of those women who placed notices in the back pages of newspapers seeking a match through correspondence. She had too much pride for that, or perhaps too much fear, though she could not have said which. What she was, sitting at that table with the rain tapping against the window glass and the candle throwing warm shadows across the walls, was profoundly lonely and more than a little frightened about the coming planting season, and she needed to tell someone about it. The name she wrote at the top of the envelope had come from a notice pinned to the board outside the feed store in Milford 3 weeks earlier. It had not been a romantic notice. It had been practical, the kind of thing that passed for community connection on the frontier in those days. The notice had read simply, "Cowboy seeking correspondence, willing to advise on livestock and land matters, replies welcome. Eli Cross, General Delivery, Harding, Kansas." She had stood in front of that board for a full 10 minutes. People had walked past her, collected their mail, discussed the price of corn, and she had stood reading those 3 sentences over and over. It was the word advise that stayed with her, not romance, not companionship. Advise. It felt safe. It felt like something she could write to without embarrassing herself. So she had written. She told Eli Cross that she was a widow, which was not quite true but felt easier than explaining her situation. And then she felt ashamed of that small lie and crossed it out and started again. And in the crossing out and the starting again, she found herself saying things she had not intended to say. She told him her father had died. She told him about the mule. She told him about the 40 acres that needed breaking before June if she had any hope of a harvest, and the fact that the plow blade was cracked and she didn't have enough saved to replace it. She told him she tried to hire help from town, but that the 2 young men who'd come to look at the work had walked the property and never returned. And then, in a moment she would later describe as temporary insanity, she told him about the stars. She wrote about how on clear nights she would sit on the porch steps and watch the sky over the open land and feel simultaneously like the luckiest woman alive and the most insignificant speck of dust in the universe. She wrote that she had never told anyone that before. She wrote that she wasn't sure why she was telling a stranger. She apologized 3 times in the last paragraph, folded the letter, sealed it before she could change her mind, and mailed it the next morning before her courage abandoned her entirely. That had been 6 weeks ago. 6 weeks was a long time on the Nebraska frontier in the spring of 1882. Clara had done what she could with the broken plow, improvising with a borrowed hoe and sheer stubbornness to break enough ground for a modest kitchen garden. She had convinced old Harlan Beebe from the neighboring property to take a look at her barn roof in exchange for 3 jars of her apple preserves, which he claimed were the finest in the county. And she believed him because it was one of the only nice things anyone had said to her in months. She had mended fences, hauled water, and argued daily with Ezra the mule, who had developed a new habit of escaping his pen and standing in the middle of the road at dawn. She had also checked the post office every single day, which she told herself was simply part of her routine and had nothing whatsoever to do with waiting for a reply from a man named Eli Cross. On the morning of May 14th, Clara hitched Ezra to the small wagon and drove the 4 miles into Milford for supplies she needed only moderately and mail she needed desperately. The sky was the particular shade of blue that made Nebraska feel like the most beautiful place on earth, a deep, vivid, endless blue that painters came west to try to capture and invariably failed. The wildflowers were beginning along the roadsides, and Ezra, in a rare moment of cooperation, trotted along at a perfectly reasonable pace without trying to stop and eat anyone's fence posts. She tied him to the post outside Granger's general store and went first to collect her supplies, because she had learned by long experience that if she went to the post office first and there was no mail, the disappointment ruined everything else. Flour, salt, lamp oil, a spool of thread the color of autumn leaves. Mr. Granger wrapped everything in brown paper and charged her fairly because he had known her father and liked him. She crossed the dry street to the post office. Miriam Potts behind the counter saw her coming through the glass and smiled in a way that made Clara's heart do something uncomfortable. Miriam was 60 years old and had been running the Milford post office since before the railroad came through, and she had a gift for conveying important information with her facial expressions before a single word was spoken. "Morning, Clara," Miriam said, and she was already reaching under the counter. She produced an envelope. It was thick, considerably thicker than the single sheet Clara had sent. It was sealed with plain wax and addressed in a hand that was not elegant but was strong, the kind of handwriting that suggested the person had learned it with effort and used it with purpose. The letters were large and certain. Miss Clara Whitfield, Rural Route, Milford, Nebraska. And in the upper left corner, simply, E. Cross, Harding, Kansas. Clara took it with fingers that were steadier than she felt and thanked Miriam and went outside and sat on the bench in front of the post office and looked at the envelope for a long time. A dog wandered past. A woman with a baby carriage nodded at her. 2 men argued about something in front of the saloon across the street. She broke the seal. There were 4 pages inside, covered front and back in that strong, deliberate hand, and when she began to read, the world around her dropped away entirely. He started by apologizing for the delay. He had been on a cattle drive that had taken him further north than anticipated, and he had only just returned to Harding to find her letter waiting, and it had taken him another week to write back because, he said, he had written 4 different versions and thrown them all into the fire before arriving at this one, which he hoped would not offend her. He said he had never received a letter quite like hers. He said most people who wrote to him about land and livestock asked their questions, and that was the end of it, and he answered as best he could, and that was fine, that was good. He was glad to help. But her letter had kept him up 2 nights running, and he felt she deserved a proper response. He answered her practical questions first. He told her that a cracked plow blade could sometimes be repaired by a good blacksmith if the crack was clean, and he described exactly how to explain the problem to the smith in technical terms that would prevent the man from overcharging her. He said 40 acres was not impossible for one person, if she was willing to start small and build, and he outlined a planting strategy for her specific region based on the soil type she had described, one that he said would give her the best chance for a viable harvest with limited equipment. Then he paused clearly in the letter. You could see it in the way the writing changed slightly, as though he had put the pen down and picked it up again. And then he wrote about the stars. He wrote that he knew exactly what she meant. He wrote that he had been on the open range for 11 years, since he was 20 years old, and that the thing nobody ever talked about honestly was how the sky at night on the open land was not just beautiful but somehow essential, like breathing. He said he had tried to explain it once to a man in a saloon in Dodge City, and the man had looked at him like he'd lost his mind. So he had stopped trying to explain it to people and just kept it private, and he thought he would keep it private forever. But she had written about it first, so it seemed only fair to admit that he understood. He wrote that loneliness was not something to apologize for. He wrote that the frontier was full of people who were lonely and pretending not to be, and he thought that was a waste of good energy, the pretending. He wrote that she had been honest with him, a stranger, and that honesty was rarer than good farmland and worth considerably more. He wrote about his own life, briefly. He was 30 years old, he said. He had grown up in Missouri and come west as a young man looking for work after his family's farm had been taken during hard times following the war. He had been a cowhand on 3 different outfits over the years and was currently working for a rancher named Garrett outside Harding. He liked horses better than most people and was not ashamed to say so. He had never married, not because he didn't believe in it, but because the life he'd been living hadn't made it easy. And then, in the last paragraph of the last page, he wrote something that made Clara's hands go still, and her eyes fill with tears right there on the bench outside the Milford post office in the full light of a Tuesday morning. He wrote, "I don't know what you look like, Miss Whitfield, and I don't know your voice, and I know nothing about you beyond 4 pages written by candlelight during a rainstorm. But I know this much, and I'll say it plainly because you were plain with me. Have thought about you every day since I read your letter, and not in the way a man thinks about a problem. In the way a man thinks about something that matters. I hope that doesn't frighten you. Hope you write back." Clara sat on that bench and cried, quietly, in the dignified way of someone who refuses to let a public street see the full extent of what they're feeling. She pressed her fingers against her eyes and breathed carefully. An older woman paused to ask if she was all right, and Clara said she was fine. "Thank you. The sun was bright today, that was all." She drove home in a state of suspended animation, Ezra moving at his own pace while Clara held the reins loosely and read the letter again, and then a third time, and she thought about what it meant to be known, even partially, even imperfectly, by someone who had no obligation to know you at all. She wrote back that same afternoon. She did not throw any versions into the fire, because she did not have that kind of time. She told him her real name was Clara, not a shortened version of anything grander, just Clara. She told him she was not a widow. She told him she had lied about that in the original letter out of some misguided sense that it would make her situation sound more respectable, and that she was sorry for it. She told him she was 22 and that she had been running the homestead alone for 6 months, and that some days it felt like the most powerful thing she had ever done, and other days it felt like drowning very slowly in slow motion while the prairie watched with complete indifference. She thanked him for the advice about the plow blade. She told him she had found a blacksmith in Milford who had been able to repair it, and that Mr. Granger at the general store had helpfully not charged her twice as much as he could have, which she considered a personal victory. She wrote about her father. She had not planned to, but once she started, she couldn't stop. She wrote about how he had come to Nebraska from Pennsylvania when she was a child, convinced that the land would reward him if he worked it honestly and long. And it had mostly, in the way that hard land rewards hard people, which is to say without grandeur but with enough. She wrote that he had been a quiet man and a good one, and that she missed him with a physical weight she hadn't expected grief to have. And then she asked him a question. She asked what it was about horses that he liked better than people, and she said she was asking sincerely and not to be impertinent. She mailed it the next morning. His reply came in 11 days, which meant she later calculated that he had written back almost immediately. This time there were 5 pages. He answered her question about the horses first, and his answer was so thoughtful and so specific. He wrote about the way a horse communicated through the set of its ears and the angle of its neck and the tension in its back muscles, an entire language that most people never bothered to learn, that Clara read it twice and then went out to the barn and looked at Ezra the mule for a long time with new attention. And Ezra looked back at her with his large, skeptical eyes, and she laughed for the first time in months. He said he was glad she had told him the truth about not being a widow. He said it didn't change anything. He said a woman managing 40 acres alone at 22 was impressive enough without any additional credentials, and that she had nothing to manufacture to make herself worth writing to. He told her about the cattle drive in more detail, because she had asked in a postscript. He described the Cimarron River crossing in water that was higher than expected, and the way the lead steers balked and had to be coaxed, and a night of hail in Kansas that had scattered part of the herd and required 3 days of gathering to bring them back. He wrote about it with precision but also with humor, and Clara found herself laughing at the description of a cook named Podit who had opinions about biscuits that he defended with the fervor of a religious conviction. He wrote about Harding, Kansas. It was not a remarkable town, he said. It had the usual things: a saloon, a church, a general store, a blacksmith, a hotel that was mostly clean, a school. The rancher he worked for, James Garrett, was a fair man who paid on time and kept his word. The land around Harding was different from Nebraska, flatter in some places and more rolling in others, and the grass in spring was something he wished he could describe better, but that he would say was as green as anything on earth. In the second to last paragraph, he wrote that he had begun to look forward to her letters with an urgency that surprised him, and that he was a man who had spent the better part of a decade not being surprised by much, and that he did not entirely know what to do with the feeling. In the last paragraph, he asked if she might be willing to tell him one more thing. He said he was aware it was a presumptuous request from a man she had never met. He asked if she might describe herself, not in the fashion plate sense that he said he had no use for, but in the honest sense. He said he found himself wondering. Clara read that paragraph 4 times. Then she went and sat on the porch steps in the evening light, and she looked at the sky, and she thought about what it would mean to tell a stranger what she looked like, and she decided that a man who had written 16 pages of honest correspondence across 3 letters deserved an honest answer. She wrote, "Am 22, as I have said. Am not small. Am 5 feet and 6 inches tall, which made me the tallest girl in my school and which I spent considerable years being embarrassed about before I decided the embarrassment was a waste of effort. My hair is dark brown, nearly black, and I wear it pinned up because it is too heavy to wear loose during a working day, though I take it down in the evenings. My eyes are gray, which my father used to say was the color of a sky about to do something interesting. Have a scar on my left hand from a fence wire incident 3 summers ago. Think am considered ordinary looking by most standards, though my father always said I was beautiful, and I have chosen to believe him because he was a man I trusted." She paused and then added, "I would like to know what you look like if you are willing to say." His reply to that came back in 9 days. He wrote, "Fair is fair. Am 30 years old. Am 6 feet and 1 inch tall, which means I have spent most of my adult life ducking under door frames in establishments that were built for shorter men. My hair is dark, close to black when it needs cutting, which is most of the time. Have brown eyes. I have a scar on my right jaw from an encounter with an angry steer at the age of 23 that I deserved more than the steer did. Am told by my employer's wife, who is a forthright woman not given to unnecessary compliments, that am not unpleasant to look at, which I take as high praise from her. Have 2 front teeth that are slightly crooked and I have never once been ashamed of them. I do not own a portrait of myself, as the only photographer within reasonable distance of Harding produces images that look like nothing so much as a man impersonating a recently disturbed badger, but I hope this description serves." Clara laughed so hard she had to set the letter down. She wrote back immediately. The correspondence had found its rhythm now, letters crossing the distance between Nebraska and Kansas with a regularity that felt necessary, like water. They wrote about everything. Clara told him about her attempts to repair the north fence line, which was failing in ways she didn't fully understand, and he walked her through it methodically, asking the right questions. He told her about a disagreement with a neighboring rancher over water rights that Garrett was navigating, and Clara offered her thoughts, which he said were sharper than those of the lawyer Garrett had consulted, which she took as the finest compliment she had received in recent memory. They wrote about books. He kept a small collection in his bunkhouse, a Bible, a history of the Mexican War, 2 novels that a previous ranch hand had left behind, and a copy of Shakespeare's collected works that he had bought from a man in Wichita for $2, and that he was working through slowly, one play at a time. She had more books, her father's collection of agricultural texts, several novels sent over the years by her cousin in St. Louis, a complete set of Dickens that she had read so many times some of the spines had come loose. They discovered a shared admiration for David Copperfield, and this led to a letter from Eli that was 3 pages just about the character of Uriah Heep, and Clara wrote back 4 pages in response. And she thought that if she had been told 6 months ago that she would one day exchange 10 pages of literary criticism with a Kansas cowboy, she would have found that quite difficult to believe. In July, he asked if he could visit. He wrote the question plainly, without elaborate preamble, which she appreciated. He said the cattle season was winding toward the end of its major drives, and he would have leave time in August. He said he understood if she thought it was inappropriate or forward or simply too much, and he would not press the point if she said no. He said he wanted her to know that his intentions were honorable, which he acknowledged was exactly what a man whose intentions were not honorable would also say, but that he meant it, and he hoped she knew him well enough through their letters to believe him. She read that paragraph standing at the kitchen table and felt the whole world rebalance itself around a new point. She thought about it for 3 days. She walked the property in the evenings and talked to herself, which she had developed as a habit since living alone, and sometimes she talked to Ezra, who at least had the courtesy to listen without interrupting. She thought about propriety and safety and the practical reality that she had never laid eyes on this man. She thought about the 16 letters she had received from him since April, now kept in a tin box under her bed, and the way she had read each one multiple times and found something new each time. She thought about the stars and what it meant that he understood about the stars. She wrote back, "Yes, you may visit. Will require that you stay at the hotel in Milford rather than at the homestead, which I hope you will understand is less about distrust and more about preserving both our reputations in a town where people talk. Will meet you at the station. Will be the tall woman with gray eyes and dark hair, and a mule named Ezra whom cannot guarantee will behave himself." His reply: "I will be the tall man with the crooked teeth and the $4 train ticket. Am told the hotel in Harding is mostly clean, so have high hopes for Milford. Will be there on the 14th of August if that suits you." The 14th of August was 3 weeks away. Clara whitewashed the front fence, repaired the gate latch that had been giving her trouble since March, baked 6 jars of apple preserves, and argued with herself constantly about whether any of this was a reasonable thing to do. On the morning of August 14th, she put on her best dress, which was a deep blue cotton with small white buttons down the front that her father had bought for her 2 Christmases ago, and she pinned her hair up carefully, and she drove Ezra into Milford and tied him to the post outside the station, and stood on the platform with her hands clasped in front of her, and waited for the 10:15 from Wichita. The train was 7 minutes late, which she spent counting the boards in the platform under her feet. It pulled in with its great cloud of steam and its screech of brakes, and the passengers descended, and she watched each one with her heart doing something irregular in her chest. And then a man stepped down from the second car and stood on the platform and looked around, and she knew it was him before she had any logical reason to know it. He was exactly as he had described himself, and also entirely different, which is how it always is when the imagined becomes real. He was tall, yes, with dark hair that was overdue for a cut and brown eyes that moved across the platform until they found her, and when they found her they stopped, and for a moment neither of them moved. He had his hat in his hand, which she noticed. He had taken it off when he stepped off the train, as though arriving somewhere important. He was wearing a dark coat over a white shirt that looked freshly pressed, and his boots were clean, which she knew was an effort given the dust that covered everything in August. He had a saddlebag over one shoulder and a small valise in the other hand, and the scar on his jaw was more visible than she had imagined from his description, a thin silver line along the bone. He walked toward her. She stood still. When he was close enough to speak without raising his voice, he stopped and he smiled, and the crooked front teeth were exactly as described, and something in her chest released all at once like a breath held too long. "Miss Whitfield," he said. His voice was lower than she had imagined and steadier, and warm the way a fire is warm before you've quite gotten close enough to feel it. "Mr. Cross," she said. A pause. "You are exactly as I imagined," he said, "and completely different, and I don't know how both of those things are true at once." She felt the heat rise in her face. "I was thinking the same thing," she said. He looked at her for another moment, and then he held out his hand, and she shook it, and his grip was firm and work-roughened and entirely real. And standing on that platform in Milford, Nebraska, in the August heat with the steam from the train still drifting around them, Clara Whitfield understood that her life had just arranged itself into a before and an after. She showed him the town first because she didn't know what else to do with herself. The hotel, which was indeed adequately clean, the general store where Mr. Granger looked at Eli, with the assessing expression of a man who has strong opinions about who is allowed to come to town and talk to young women, he considers his responsibility to look out for. Miriam at the post office, who greeted Eli with undisguised delight and said, "So you're the one," which made Clara want to disappear into the floorboards. Eli took all of it with easy grace. He talked to Mr. Granger about the wheat futures with enough knowledge to satisfy the man's territorial instincts. He told Miriam that her post office was the best organized one he had seen between Kansas and the Nebraska border, which was almost certainly flattery, but which Miriam received as simple truth. Clara watched him move through her town and felt something ease in her, the particular tension of introducing someone you have decided to trust to people who will tell you whether you were right. They had dinner at the hotel that evening, a meal that was modest but respectable, beef stew and bread and strong coffee. They talked for 3 hours. The letters had been good, had been better than good, but the conversation was different in the way that all conversation is different from written words. It moved faster, doubled back, laughed at itself. He was quieter in person than she had somehow expected, more prone to listening than talking, and when he did talk he said exactly what he meant and no more and no less, and she found she admired that with an intensity that surprised her. He asked about her father. She talked about him for 20 minutes without stopping, and he listened with his full attention, not the polite attention of someone waiting for his turn to speak but the real kind, and when she finished he said, "He sounds like a man who knew what mattered," and she had to look at her coffee cup for a moment. She asked about his family in Missouri. He was quiet for a moment before he answered. He said his father had been a difficult man, not violent but cold in the way some men are cold when life has compressed them into someone smaller than they meant to be. He said his mother had been the best person he had ever known, practical and funny and loving in the unsentimental way of people who have too much work to be sentimental. She had died of fever when he was 17. He said he missed her still, that the missing had not diminished with time so much as become familiar, like a stone he carried that he no longer thought about but whose weight he always felt. Clara reached across the table and touched his hand. She had not planned to do it. He looked down at her hand on his and then up at her face, and what she saw in his expression was not surprise but something more like recognition, the look of a man who has been waiting for something without knowing he was waiting. She pulled her hand back. They both looked at their coffee. "Should get you home," he said. "You have an early morning, I expect." "I always have an early morning," she said. He drove her home in her wagon, which he handled competently and without fuss, and Ezra, to her absolute astonishment, behaved perfectly the entire way, trotting along with his ears up and his opinions kept to himself for once. She did not comment on this miracle. She was afraid that drawing attention to it would break the spell. At the homestead gate, he climbed down and helped her down and stood in the moonlight holding her hand just slightly longer than strictly necessary, and then let go. And she stood in front of her gate and watched him drive back toward town, and felt the prairie spread out enormous and silver around her, and thought that the world was a considerably more interesting place than it had been that morning. He stayed 4 days. Every day she picked him up at the hotel and brought him to the homestead, and they worked together. She had not planned for that part. She had imagined something more ceremonial, walks and conversation and perhaps a picnic. But on the first morning he appeared in work clothes rather than his good coat and asked what needed doing, and she told him about the north fence line, and he said he had brought his tools as a matter of habit, and that was that. He was an extraordinary worker. Efficient and focused and tireless in the way of someone who has spent years in physical labor without resentment. He repaired the north fence in a day and a half, rebuilding 3 sections that she had been managing with improvised patches for months. He looked at the barn roof that Harlan Beebe had patched and identified 2 places where it would fail again before winter and fixed them. He asked if she had any trouble with the well, and she said the rope pulley mechanism was giving her difficulty, and he spent an afternoon taking it apart and putting it back together so smoothly that drawing water became effortless. She cooked for them. Proper meals, the kind she didn't make just for herself because the effort seemed disproportionate for one person. She made her best bread and a stew with the last of the smoked pork from winter and a peach cobbler from the fruit she had put up the week before. He ate with the appreciation of a man who has been eating trail food for months, which she found deeply satisfying. In the evenings, they sat on the porch steps. The first evening was quiet, both of them tired from the work, and they watched the sun go down over the western land in a long, slow burn of orange and pink and violet that turned the whole sky into something almost impossible. And she heard him exhale next to her in the way people exhale when they are moved by something and trying not to show it. The second evening he told her about Harding. He described the ranch in detail, the layout of the land and the cattle operation and what he did each day, and she listened and asked questions, and he seemed pleased that her questions were specific and practical. He said most people asked about gunfights when he described the frontier life, as though that were the primary event of the average day, and that the actual primary events of the average day were feeding animals and repairing equipment and arguing about whether it was going to rain. The third evening, he told her something he said he had not told many people. He told her that he had been saving money. That for the past 4 years he had been putting away a portion of every paycheck, not spending it in saloons the way most cowboys did, not gambling it, just saving it quietly and deliberately towards something he could not quite name. He said that recently he had begun to think he knew what that something was. He did not say more than that. The night insects were very loud. The sky was extraordinary. Clara sat beside him and felt the warmth of his shoulder close to hers, and thought about how strange it was that 6 months ago she had sat on these same steps entirely alone and looked at this same sky. And now there was a man beside her who understood exactly what she was looking at. On the fourth morning, the last morning, he came early. Too early for courtesy, so early that she was still in the yard feeding the chickens when she heard the wagon and turned to see him driving up the road in the gray pre-dawn light. She stood with her grain bucket and watched him climb down, and something about his face was different. Resolved. "Set, I need to say something to you," he said, "and I thought I'd better say it before I lost my nerve, which will happen if I have to ride back to Harding without saying it." She put down the grain bucket. The chickens milled around her feet, indignant. "Say it then," she said. He stood 10 feet away from her in the early morning light with his hat in his hands, and he said, "I think am in love with you. Have been since the second letter, maybe the first. I know this is not the usual order of things. I know we have only just met in person. I know you have every reason to tell me I'm moving too fast and that you need more time, and if you tell me that, I will respect it completely, and I will write to you for as long as you want and wait for as long as it takes. But I need you to know that I'm not confused about this. I'm 30 years old and I have been confused about a lot of things in my life, but I'm not confused about this." Clara set the grain bucket fully on the ground and walked toward him across the yard. She stopped when she was close enough that she had to look up slightly to see his face, which was not a sensation she was accustomed to at her height. "Illy," she said. "Yes," he said. "I wrote one letter to a cowboy I had never met," she said. And his reply brought me to tears, not because it was sad, because it was the first time in a very long time that I felt like someone saw me. Not a widow, not an orphan, not a problem to solve, just me exactly as I am. He said nothing, but his expression did everything words couldn't. "I'm in love with you too," she said. "I think I have been since you wrote about the stars. Just didn't have a name for it yet." He put his hat on his head and then he took her hand, very carefully, the way you handle something you understand to be valuable and fragile, and he held it, and she let him, and they stood in the yard with the chickens making their small disapproving sounds around them, and the morning coming up pink and gold over the eastern edge of the world. And it was as good a moment as Clara Whitfield had ever experienced in her 22 years on the earth. He left that afternoon. He had to get back to Harding, to the ranch, to his job, and they both understood this, and neither of them pretended otherwise. She drove him to the station and stood on the platform while the train waited, and this time they did not shake hands. He kissed her cheek, briefly and formally, which in 1882 on a public train platform was more than enough to be observed and commented upon, and she felt the heat of it for hours afterward. "I will write to you every week," he said. "I expect you to hold to that," she said. He boarded the train. She stood on the platform until it rounded the bend south of town and disappeared, and then she drove Ezra home and sat down at the kitchen table and wrote him a letter the same evening, because waiting until morning seemed impossible. The correspondence that followed was different from before, not less frequent but differently charged, the way weather changes before a storm, not threatening but electric. He wrote every week as promised, sometimes more. He described the end of the cattle season and the autumn work on the ranch, the preparations for winter, the particular quality of Kansas light in October. She told him about the harvest, modest but adequate, enough to see her through the winter if she was careful. She told him about the first snow of November and how Ezra had stood in the middle of it looking personally offended. In September, he wrote that he had spoken to his employer about his plans and that Garrett had been good about it. In October, he wrote that he had been making inquiries in Harding about available land, because he felt that a man who was planning a life should know what the land around him was worth. She read that letter 3 times on the porch in the cold October air, and went inside and sat very still for a while. In November, she wrote that her brother Thomas had written from California. He was alive and working, and said he was sorry for the long silence, that the mining operation had taken him to places where mail delivery was unreliable, and that he had thought of her often. She wrote that she had been very angry and very relieved in equal and simultaneous measure, and that she had written back immediately. Eli wrote that this was good news, that family, even imperfect family, was worth holding onto. In December, he wrote that he would like to come back to Milford at Christmas. She wrote back, "Yes, please." He arrived on December 23rd on the afternoon train. She had been in the habit, by this point, of driving herself to the station in a composed and practical manner. She stood on the platform in her warmest coat with her hands in her pockets and watched the train come in and watched him step off. And the sight of him still did what the sight of him had done in August, arranged the world into a better configuration than it had been in before he arrived. Christmas in Milford, Nebraska, in 1882 was a modest thing. The town had a Christmas tree in the church, decorated with paper chains and candles, and a service that Clara attended regularly. Mr. Granger had put out a small display of Christmas sweets in the general store that were already half gone by December 23rd. It snowed on Christmas Eve, a clean, steady snow that covered the town and the surrounding land in silence and white. Eli came to the homestead on Christmas morning. She had cooked, working since before dawn, a proper Christmas dinner with a chicken she had raised herself and roasted potatoes and a pie made from preserved apples and every spice she could afford. He brought her a gift he had wrapped himself in brown paper tied with red string, a small book of American poetry, thin but beautiful, with a note inside that said, "For reading on the porch steps under the good sky." She had made him something. She was a competent seamstress, not exceptional but careful, and she had sewn him a pair of work gloves from leather she had bought from the tanner in Milford, lined with rabbit fur and stitched along the back with small, neat crosses that she had told herself were purely decorative and which she knew were not. He held the gloves for a long time without speaking. "They are practical," she said, because silence made her nervous. "They are the finest thing anyone has ever made for me," he said, and she believed him. They ate dinner by the fire in the main room of the homestead, the small house warm and bright against the December outside, and they talked for hours the way they had been talking in letters for 8 months, except now the talking was better because she could see his face, could watch the way he laughed, the way he listened, the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching, which she was. After dinner he asked if he could speak to her about something serious, and she said yes, and her heart was doing the irregular thing again. He said, "Have saved enough money for a down payment on land. Have found a parcel of 300 acres for sale outside of Harding that has good water and decent soil and would support cattle and some farming both. Have spoken to Garrett, and he is willing to help me get started and to remain a neighbor." He stopped. "What I'm asking is whether you would be willing to come to Kansas. Whether you would be willing to marry me, Clara, and come to Harding and build something there with me. I know you love this land." He looked around the small room at the whitewashed walls and the low ceiling and the fire. "I know what leaving it would cost you, and I'm asking anyway because I think what we would build together would be worth the cost. But I also want you to know that if you say no, if you want to stay here on this land that was your father's, we'll find another way. We'll come here. We'll make it work. However it needs to happen, I want it to happen." The fire crackled. Outside the snow was still falling, silent and persistent. Clara looked at the man across the table from her. The dark hair and the brown eyes and the scar on his jaw and the crooked teeth that she had come to find entirely beautiful. And she thought about her father, who had left Pennsylvania for Nebraska because he believed that good land rewarded good work. And she thought about Thomas in California and the letters between them that had resumed and were rebuilding something that had frayed. And she thought about the tin box under her bed with its stack of letters from Eli Cross that she had read so many times the folds were wearing through. and she thought about the 400 miles of winter between Milford and Harding, and how she had driven those miles in her mind so many times in the past 8 months that she felt she already knew the road. She said, "Yes," one word. His face did something complicated and then settled into something simple, something that looked very much like relief and joy occupying the same expression simultaneously. "Yes to Harding," he said, making sure. "Yes to all of it," she said. "Yes to Kansas and the 300 acres and the cattle and the building something. Yes to you, Eli. Have been saying yes to you since August. I just hadn't found the right word for it." He reached across the table and took both her hands, and they sat there while the fire burned down and the snow fell, and the prairie lay still and white outside. And Clara Whitfield, who had once written one honest letter to a stranger and been frightened afterward of what she had revealed, thought that honesty was the finest thing she had ever done. They were married in February of 1883. The ceremony took place at the Milford Church on a bright cold Saturday, with about 20 people in attendance and Miriam from the post office crying openly in the third row and not bothering to hide it. Thomas had written from California that he could not make the distance in time, but that he was glad, that he was sorry he hadn't been there to take better care of her. And Clara had written back that she had taken perfectly good care of herself, and that she would see him when she saw him, and that she loved him. His reply to that had arrived 2 days before the wedding, and she had tucked it in her coat pocket and worn it close all day. Eli stood at the front of the church in the dark coat he had worn when he stepped off the train in August, cleaned and brushed. And when she walked toward him down the aisle, she watched his face and saw on it the same thing she had seen on the platform that first day, that quality of recognition, of a man who sees what he was looking for and knows it without question. They said their vows in the plain language of a frontier church, promises made before God and Miriam and Mr. Granger and Harlan Beebe, and the rest of a town that had come to regard Eli Cross, over the preceding months, as a decent man who treated Clara right and who knew things about cattle and fences that had already proven useful to several of the neighboring homesteaders who had stopped by when he was visiting. After the ceremony, they had a modest reception in the church hall. Cake and coffee, and good conversation and music from a fiddle player named Archie Dunn, who played reels until the cold made the strings go flat, and everyone agreed it was time to go home. They left for Harding 2 weeks later. Clara sold what she could from the homestead and stored what couldn't be sold in a deal she made with Harlan Beebe, who would look after the property until Thomas came back or until some other arrangement presented itself. She took her father's agricultural texts and her complete Dickens and the tin box of letters and her winter preserves and Ezra, who boarded the livestock car of the Wichita Railroad with an expression of supreme displeasure that he maintained for the entire journey. Harding, Kansas, was smaller than Milford, but felt in some ways more alive, the way young towns do when they are still deciding what they will become. The land around it was wide and rolling with a quality of light she had not expected, different from Nebraska's light in ways she couldn't fully articulate but that she felt, a warmth that lay closer to the earth. The 300 acres Eli had bought sat 5 miles south of town. The house on it was small. 2 rooms and a lean-to kitchen and a barn that was larger than the house, which he said was the right priority for a cattle operation, and she agreed, having spent considerable time in barns herself. The house would grow. He said this without apology and with complete confidence, and she believed him. They moved in on a Thursday afternoon in late February. Eli carried boxes while she unpacked them, and they arranged the small space with the practical efficiency of 2 people who each had opinions, but who had learned through letters and through 4 days of August work how to make those opinions work together. She hung her father's best survey map of Nebraska on the wall, and he did not ask why and she did not explain, and he came and stood beside her and looked at it for a moment and said nothing, which was the right thing. That first evening on their own land, She thought that with a sensation she could only describe as fullness, they sat on the front step of the small house and watched the Kansas sky go dark, and the stars came out, enormous and certain, and Eli put his arm around her and she leaned into his side, and neither of them said anything about the stars because they already knew what the other one thought and it did not require words. Spring came. The work was relentless and wonderful. Eli knew cattle the way he knew horses, with intimacy and skill, and he had bought 12 head to start on and they were good stock. Clara planted a kitchen garden within the first 2 weeks, working the soil with the knowledge of a woman who had been breaking prairie earth since childhood. She found the soil in Kansas kinder than Nebraska in some ways, more willing. She grew enough by summer to keep them fed and to have extra for preserving. She went into herding regularly and met people, because she was by nature sociable, and because a rancher's wife who stays isolated becomes miserable and makes her husband the same, which she had no intention of doing. She made friends with Ellen Garrett, the rancher's wife Eli had mentioned in the letters as forthright and not given to unnecessary compliments, who turned out to be a stout, warm, sharp-minded woman of 45 who had been on the Kansas frontier for 20 years, and who took to Clara with an efficiency that suggested she had been waiting for someone interesting to come along. Ellen introduced her to the other women of the community. Some were welcoming. A few were cautious, the way established communities are cautious of newcomers, testing the character of someone new before deciding whether to extend their trust. Clara did not perform for anyone. She said what she thought, she worked hard, she helped when help was needed, and within 3 months she had been asked to join the church committee for the Harvest Festival and had agreed with genuine pleasure. The injustice of the frontier was not invisible to her. She watched the Osage people who occasionally passed through the territory, the way they were treated in town, spoken to with contempt by some and with studied avoidance by others, and she felt the wrongness of it as a physical thing. Eli felt it too. He said one evening that the frontier was built on land that had not been freely given, and that people who pretended otherwise were not being honest with themselves, and that honesty, as she knew, was something he considered essential. He treated every person he encountered with the same direct respect, and in a time and place when this was not universal, she loved him for it. In the fall of 1883, Clara wrote to Thomas in California. She told him about the ranch and the cattle and the house that she and Eli had been expanding room by room, adding a proper bedroom and a sitting room with space for her books. She told him she was happy. Not in the way people write, "am happy," when they mean "please stop worrying about me," but in the specific, detailed, evidenced way that leaves no room for doubt. She told him about the land and the light and Ezra, who had adapted to Kansas with considerable dignity after his initial protest, and had developed a friendship with the ranch horses that she found deeply gratifying. She told him that the door was open whenever he was ready to come east. Thomas arrived in November of 1883, not as a visit, as a homecoming. The mining operation in California had played out, and he had money enough to travel on, and a desire to be near family that he said had been building for 2 years, and had finally become impossible to ignore. He was 28, thin and weathered from California sun, and he stood in the yard of the Harding Ranch and looked at his sister, and then at the man beside her, and then at the sky, and then back at his sister and said, "You look better than you have since before Mama died." She hugged him hard enough that he laughed. Eli shook his hand and said, "We have room if you want to stay," and Thomas said he didn't want to impose, and Eli said, "A man who helps with the work isn't an imposition. A man who doesn't is. Make up your mind which you want to be." Thomas stayed. He turned out to be an excellent hand with the cattle, having picked up skills in California from various enterprises that turned out to translate well to ranching, and he and Eli developed the easy, teasing brotherhood of men who respect each other's competence and find each other's company genuine. Clara watched them argue about fence posts and herd management and the best angle to approach a steer with a bad attitude, and she felt something in her chest that she identified after some thought as completeness. Not perfection. Something better than perfection. A life that was full of the right things. In the early spring of 1884, Clara told Eli she was expecting a child. She told him at the breakfast table on a Tuesday morning in March, plainly and directly, because that was how they told each other things, and she watched his face go through several expressions in quick succession before settling on something she had never seen on it before. A kind of stunned joy that was entirely unguarded, that he made no attempt whatsoever to control. He stood up from the table and came around to her side and pulled her up and held her, and she felt him shake once, briefly, like a man who has just set down something very heavy after carrying it a long distance. "A baby," he said into her hair. "That is generally how it works," she said, which made him laugh, and they stood in the kitchen while the spring light came through the window and the Kansas morning went on outside, and she thought, "This is the life my father crossed Pennsylvania for. This is what the land can hold. Not just crops or cattle or the practical accumulation of effort. This." Their son, William James Cross, was born on September 8, 1884, in the bedroom of the ranch house that Eli had built with his own hands that previous winter. Ellen Garrett was there, having delivered more children on the Kansas frontier than she could easily count, and she was exactly the right person to have in a room where something important and difficult was happening. The labor was long but uncomplicated, and Clara, who had not entirely prepared herself for the reality of the experience despite having read every agricultural text her father owned that touched on the subject of livestock births, which was not precisely the same but gave her a framework, discovered that she was more capable than she had imagined and more frightened, and that both of these things could be simultaneously true. William James arrived in the late afternoon with the particular indignation of a healthy child who has opinions about being born and is not shy about expressing them. He was placed in Clara's arms, and she looked at him and felt the world reorganize again, the way it had been reorganizing steadily since she had sat down at a kitchen table in Nebraska 2 years before to write a letter she had not planned to write. She heard Eli's voice in the hall. Ellen opened the bedroom door and said, "Come see your son." He came in slowly, carefully, as though moving too quickly might disturb something fragile in the air. He stood beside the bed and looked at the small, red, furiously vocal person she was holding, and then he looked at her, and she had never seen his face like this before, stripped entirely of its usual composure, wide open. "Hello," he said, very softly. It was not clear if he was addressing her or the baby. She held William James out to him, and he took him with large, careful hands, the same hands that had repaired her fence line and her barn pulley and built the bedroom they were standing in, and he held his son against his chest and looked at him for a long time without speaking. Then he looked at Clara. "Thank you," he said. "We both did the work," she said. "You did considerably more of it," he said, which made Ellen from the corner of the room snort with approval. Thomas came in after and held his nephew with the practiced ease of someone who had, it turned out, several cousins and was comfortable with babies, and declared him the finest child in Kansas, which Eli said was accurate, and Clara said was certainly possible, but that they should perhaps wait for the boy to do something before attributing qualities to him. William James grew. He was a strong, curious child with his father's dark hair and his mother's gray eyes, which Eli observed with deep satisfaction, and said made him look like a sky about to do something interesting, repeating her father's phrase with a smile that told her he had remembered it from a letter written nearly 3 years before. Clara wrote to Miriam at the Milford post office to announce the birth. Miriam wrote back with a letter so effusive and warm that it made Clara cry the good kind of tears. She wrote to Thomas's address even though Thomas was in the next room, because she felt the occasion deserved formal recording. Thomas said she was ridiculous, and then read the letter twice. By 1885, the ranch had grown. Eli had expanded the herd to 40 head and taken on 2 additional hands, young men from town who worked hard and were worth the wages. The house had acquired a proper kitchen and a room for William and a covered porch that wrapped around 2 sides of the building, which Clara had suggested, and Eli had built over the course of one long summer weekend with Thomas's help. The porch had 2 chairs side by side, and a view of the open land to the south that changed with every season and was always, in its own way, extraordinary. Thomas had staked his own claim on a parcel adjacent to the Cross Ranch, 80 acres, that he had been working through the previous 2 seasons, with the methodical patience he had learned in California and brought home. He had also, by the summer of 1885, begun corresponding with a woman in Topeka whom he had met during a supply run, and he showed Clara her letters with the particular sheepishness of a man who wants to share something joyful and is not yet sure whether it's permanent enough to celebrate. Clara read the first letter and said, "She writes well, she's direct. I like her already." Thomas said, "You can't know that from one letter," and Clara said, "That is exactly how you can know it," and Thomas had no reply to that. The woman's name was Margaret. She came to visit in the autumn of 1885, a compact, practical, dark-eyed woman of 24 who looked at Thomas's 80 acres with the eye of someone calculating not what it was but what it could become, and Clara loved her immediately and entirely. Margaret looked at Clara's ranch and the growing herd and the house with its covered porch and the 2 chairs and said to Clara privately, "He talks about all of you constantly, you know, about what you have built here." And Clara said, "We built it from one letter," and Margaret said, "That is either the most romantic or the most terrifying thing I've ever heard," and Clara said, "It was a little of both at the time." Thomas and Margaret were married in the spring of 1886. In the Harding Church, a ceremony that was somewhat larger than Clara and Eli's had been because Margaret had a family in Topeka who made the journey, and Ellen Garrett provided a wedding feast that was by any measure the finest meal produced in Harding County that year. Clara stood beside Thomas during the ceremony and held William James on her hip and felt him squirm with 2-year-old impatience, and looked across to where Eli stood with the other witnesses and caught his eye, and he smiled at her across the room in the way that had always felt like a private language, specific and certain. In the winter of 1886, sitting by the fire one evening while William slept and the Kansas wind worked at the windows, and the lamp threw its warm circle of light across the sitting room, Eli said, "Do you ever miss Nebraska?" Clara considered this seriously. She looked at the fire for a while. "I miss the memory of it," she said. "I miss my father in it. I miss who I was before I was happy sometimes, the way you miss any part of yourself that is gone, but I don't want to go back." She paused. "This is home. You are home." She looked at him. "Do you understand what I mean?" He said, "Yes, exactly," and then he was quiet for a moment. "I want to show you something tomorrow, something I have been working on." She raised an eyebrow. He smiled with deliberate inscrutability and went back to reading his Shakespeare, which he was now on his 3rd complete rotation through, and she went back to her Dickens, and the fire burned down, and outside the stars were doing what they always did, being vast and indifferent and magnificent, and inside the lamp burned warm. In the morning he took her out to the south field, the one she had always found the most beautiful because of the way the grass rolled in wind like the surface of the sea, and he showed her what he had been building. It was a simple structure, not a barn and not quite a room but something between, a kind of extended porch shelter open on the south side with a wooden floor and a comfortable bench and a small iron brazier for cold nights, set into the hillside so that the roof did not obstruct the view. The view was entirely south, entirely open, an uninterrupted line of land and sky. "For the stars," he said. "A proper place for the stars." She stood in the shelter and looked south at the open Kansas country and the sky above it, and she thought of the letter she had written at a kitchen table in Nebraska in the rain, and the reply that had made her cry on a bench in front of the Milford post office, and everything that had followed from those two documents, the correspondence and the visit and the train and the vows and William and the porch and Thomas and Margaret, and all the seasons of the ranch and all the mornings and all the evenings and all the conversations and all the silence and all the work and all the joy. She turned and looked at Eli standing in his field in the February morning light, tall and dark-haired and permanent-looking, like something the land had grown itself. "Come here," she said. He came. She took his face in her hands the way she had been doing for 3 years now, the particular gesture that was hers alone, that she had developed without planning, because his face was something she needed to hold when certain things were true. And she kissed him properly, in the middle of the open field, with the Kansas wind moving around them and Ezra visible in the far paddock making his opinion about February known to no one in particular. When she pulled back, he was smiling the full smile, the one that showed the crooked front teeth she had loved from the first moment she saw them. "You built me a star-watching shelter," she said. "You told me about the stars first," he said. "It seemed like the right response." She laughed. "Your letters were always full of right responses." He put his arms around her, and she leaned into his chest, and they stood in the February field. And she felt the heartbeat of the man she loved under her ear, steady and sure. And the land all around them was theirs, genuinely and legally, and in the deeper sense of being earned by care and intention. And the sky above them was the same sky she had watched alone from the porch steps of a Nebraska homestead 2 years before, and it was better now because someone was watching it with her. In the spring of 1887, Clara discovered she was expecting again. She told Eli on a Tuesday morning at the breakfast table, because Tuesday morning breakfast seemed to be the time for important announcements in their household. And his face did the same thing it had done before, the stunning and the joy arriving together, though slightly less stunned this time because the mechanics of the situation were more familiar. Their second child, a girl they named Frances Eliza Cross after Eli's mother and Clara's paternal grandmother, was born in November of 1887 on a cold, bright Kansas day that smelled of coming snow. She arrived more efficiently than her brother had, as though she had considered the matter and decided not to make a production of it, and she came into the world with a calm expression that made Ellen Garrett say she had never seen a newborn look quite so determined, which turned out to be an accurate summary of Frances Cross's general character for the next several decades. William James, at 3, regarded his sister with the cautious assessment of someone who has been promised something and is reserving judgment. He sat beside Clara on the bed and looked at Frances with great seriousness, and then said, "She is very small." Clara said, "You were small too," and William said, "I don't think so," which made Eli laugh from the doorway. Thomas and Margaret's first child, a boy named Henry, had been born in June of that year, and so the two families, neighbors by land and by choice, grew in parallel, the children growing up together on adjacent properties with the easy comfort of cousins who know each other before they know themselves. By 1889, when Kansas was fully settled and no longer quite so wild in the old sense, though still wide and still demanding and still capable of weather that reminded you that the land preceded you and would outlast you, the Cross Ranch had grown to 60 head of cattle, 120 acres of active grazing land, a house with 6 proper rooms and the covered porch with its 2 chairs, a barn that William James considered his personal kingdom, and a star-watching shelter in the south field that was used regularly by the whole family and occasionally by Thomas and Margaret as well, who had their own admiration for the sky. Ellie sat on the porch one September evening with the smell of the harvest season in the air and William James at his feet, drawing something in the dirt with a stick and Francis asleep inside, and Clara in the kitchen making something that involved cinnamon and made the whole house warm with the smell of it. And he thought about the letter. He thought about it often, though he had never told Clara that. He thought about sitting in the bunkhouse in Harding one evening after a long drive, and finding her letter in the pile of mail someone had collected from town, and reading it once and then reading it again, and going outside to stand in the night air because the bunkhouse felt too small suddenly for what he was feeling. He had tried to explain it to Podet, the cook, who was a philosophical man despite his opinions about biscuits. He had said that he had received a letter from a woman in Nebraska he had never met, and that it had done something to him that he couldn't account for, and Podet had said, "Well, write back then," with the brisk practicality of someone who considers most of life's complications to have simple solutions. And Eli had written back, and arrived at a Tuesday in August and a platform and a woman in a blue dress with gray eyes, who looked at him with the particular expression of someone who has been honest with a stranger and is hoping the stranger was worth it. She had been right to write the letter. He had been right to answer it. He had tried once, not long after they married, to explain what the letter had meant to him, and she had listened and then said, "I almost didn't send it. I nearly burned it." And he had felt in retrospect the specific terror of how close he had come to not finding her, and he had said, "I'm very glad you didn't," with a vehemence that had surprised even him, and she had looked at him steadily and said, "So am I." Clara came out onto the porch with 2 cups of coffee, and handed him one, and settled into the chair beside him, and put her feet up on the railing the way she always did, the particular domestic comfort of a woman who owns her own porch and is not shy about it. William James had abandoned his dirt drawing and was chasing something in the yard that appeared to be a cricket. Ezra, who was getting old now and moved with the dignity of a mule who has decided he has paid all the dues that can reasonably be asked of him, stood at the fence and watched William James with cautious interest. "What are you thinking about?" Clara asked. "The letter," he said. She turned to look at him. "Which letter? We've written a great many letters." "The first one," he said. "Yours." She was quiet for a moment. The evening was warm and still, and the light was the long gold light of September, the kind that makes everything look like it is being remembered rather than happening. "I was terrified," she said. "I thought I was completely insane for sending it." "You weren't," he said. "No," she agreed. "I wasn't." He reached over and took her hand and held it, and she let him, and they sat in the September evening on their covered porch on their own land in Kansas, with their son chasing insects and their daughter sleeping inside, and the sky above them going through its evening transformation, all that dramatic color that never lost its power to astonish. And Clara thought that some things could not be planned and should not be, that the most important things arrived sideways, through the back door, in the form of a letter written on a rainy night by a lonely woman to a man she had never met. She had told him about the stars. He had understood, from that understanding, everything. William James caught his cricket and held it up triumphantly, his gray eyes bright with the particular joy of a small boy who has successfully hunted something. "Papa," he said. "Look." "I see it," Eli said. "Is it not the finest cricket in Kansas?" William James asked, which was a phrase he had picked up from Thomas's description of Henry, and applied liberally to everything he considered worth celebrating. "Without question," Eli said gravely. Clara laughed, a full and unguarded sound, and the Kansas evening held them all, and the stars were beginning to appear above the darkening land, 1 and then 2 and then 1,000, and they were watching as they had always watched together. The tin box of letters still lived under the bed in the main bedroom of the ranch house. Clara had transferred it from Nebraska to Kansas with the same care she had given to her books and her father's survey map. She had added to it over the years, Not just the early correspondence, but a few particularly good letters from after their marriage, times when Eli had been away on business and had written to her. Shorter notes, but still bearing that quality of saying exactly what was true and no more. She had also added, at some point that she could not precisely identify, the first response letter, the one that had made her cry on the bench in Milford, to the very top of the pile, so that it was always the first thing she saw when she opened the box. She had read it so many times the paper was soft at the folds. She knew whole paragraphs of it by heart. She could recite the part about the stars without looking at the page. She did not do this often. She did it when she needed to, when the work was hard and the weather was against them, and the weight of running a life on the frontier pressed down in ways that even love could not entirely lighten. She would sit on the edge of the bed and open the box and read the letter, and she would feel again what she had felt on the bench in Milford, the sensation of being seen, which was the foundation on which everything else was built. She told Francis about the letters when Francis was old enough to understand, sitting together one evening in the star-watching shelter with the sky enormous above them. She did not tell her as a romantic fairy tale, but as a true story, the way her father had told her true stories, plainly and with all the important details included. She told her about the loneliness and the fear and the cracked plow blade and the notice on the board outside the feed store and the letter written by candlelight in the rain. Frances listened with the focused attention that was her particular gift, dark-haired and gray-eyed like her parents in different combinations, and when Clara finished she was quiet for a moment and then said, "You were very brave to write it." Clara thought about this. "I was very honest," she said. "I'm not sure that is the same thing as bravery." Frances considered this further. "I think perhaps honesty is bravery," she said, with the certainty of a 7-year-old who has not yet learned to doubt her own conclusions, and Clara thought she was probably right and told her so. Eli, when Clara told him about this conversation, said that Frances had clearly inherited her mother's capacity for cutting through things to the center, which Clara took as a compliment, and which she was fairly certain was intended as one. The years on the Cross Ranch in Harding, Kansas, passed with the fullness that good years have, not without difficulty, not without seasons of drought and seasons of hard work that left them both exhausted beyond speech, not without the ordinary frictions of two strong-willed people building a shared life in close quarters and close dependence. There were arguments, because they were both people who said what they thought and who sometimes thought different things, and arguments between honest people are loud and frank, and more often than not more useful than silence. They learned each other's minds the way you learn difficult terrain, by traveling it repeatedly and paying attention. But the love was constant, not the trembling, terrified love of the early letters, though she had loved that love and would not have traded it. A different kind, the kind that has had time to settle into its full dimensions, that has been tested by weather and work and the 1,000 ordinary days that make up a life. The kind that does not require declaration because it is visible in everything. In the 2 chairs on the covered porch, in the star-watching shelter in the south field, in the way he still took her hand when they sat together in the evenings, in the way she still noticed him crossing the yard in the morning light with the same arrested attention she had felt on the Milford train platform. By 1890, William James was 6 years old and in school in Harding, where he demonstrated a particular gift for mathematics and a parallel gift for talking when he should have been working, which his teacher, a patient woman named Mrs. Alcott, managed with firm affection. Frances was 3 and entirely sure of herself in every situation. Thomas and Margaret's children, Henry and the new baby, a girl named Clara after her aunt, filled the neighboring property with noise and life. The 2 ranches functioned with the cooperation of families who have chosen each other and know it, sharing equipment and labor during harvest, trading skills and provisions through the winter, spending Sunday afternoons together in ways that had become ritual. In the evenings of 1890, Clara and Eli still sat on the porch with their coffee. The ritual had not varied in 7 years. The land had changed around them, grown more settled, the wildness of the earlier decade giving way to something more established. But the sky above the Kansas South field was exactly the same sky it had always been. Vast and indifferent and magnificent, and entirely willing to be watched by anyone patient enough to look. She thought sometimes about the woman she had been before the letter. 22 years old and frightened and alone on 40 acres in Nebraska, watching that same sky with a loneliness she had not yet learned to name. She felt for that woman something that was not quite pity but was gentle. The recognition of someone looking back at their former self with the knowledge of what was coming, all the fullness and the love and the years and the children that the woman alone on the porch steps could not yet see. She had written one letter to a cowboy she had never met. His reply had brought her to tears, right there on a bench in front of a post office in a small Nebraska town, because it had said what she had not known she needed to hear, that she was seen, that her honesty mattered, that someone who had every reason to answer with practical information only had chosen instead to answer with truth. Everything else had followed from that. The ranch and the cattle and the house with its 6 rooms and the porch with its 2 chairs, and the star-watching shelter and William James and Francis and Thomas and Margaret and the whole interwoven life of it, every thread running back to a rainy April evening in 1882, when a woman had sat down to write one thing and had written something else entirely. She reached over and found his hand in the September dark. He held it. Above them, the Kansas stars came out one by one, and then all at once, filling the enormous sky with their cold, bright certainty. And below them the land lay quiet and owned and loved. And inside the house 2 children slept, and somewhere to the east across 400 miles of prairie, the homestead in Nebraska stood under the same sky. Harlan Beebe's lamp visible in its window, and somewhere to the west Thomas's ranch was settling into evening, and the whole long web of connection stretched between these points, held together by care and by work, and by the particular and irreplaceable fact that one honest letter had found its way to the right person, and that person had had the wisdom and the courage to reply. Eli turned his head and looked at her in the darkness. "The sky is good tonight," he said. She looked up. "It is," she said. They watched it together as they had always watched it, as they would always watch it, the 2 of them and the stars and the wide-open Kansas night complete.